Being a conscious black metal fan is difficult. Really, anyone with a passing knowledge of black metal knows that the genre has a serious problem with Nazism. Especially in this day and age, every musical genre, both inside and outside of metal, has a certain proportion of bands that have fallen to fascist influence, but it is far more pronounced in black metal than it is in most any other genre, both in proportion and intensity. A rather shocking number of black metal bands are outright Nazis, and many more have strong connections to such bands. It's such a large problem that an entire subgenre within black metal was created to highlight it, namely National Socialist Black Metal, or NSBM. Some bands aren't even subtle about it either, with many writing lyrics utilizing fascist dog whistles, some using symbols commonly associated with white supremacy, and even a few going as far as to include Nazi allusions in the band names themselves. But how did black metal come to develop such an infestation of Nazism? Now, metal is no stranger to bands that go as far as they can to shock people, but even similarly extreme subgenres like death metal or doom metal do not have even close to the same problem with Nazism that black metal does. Even weirder, the foundations of the genre not only lacked the problem, but many of the most important bands were and continue to be left-leaning as well. Well, the root of the problem was established during the infamous early 90s black metal scene in Norway as what is now referred to as the first wave transitioned into the second wave. The formation and later ethos of the scene, while not explicitly Nazi in nature, fostered the ideology both in Norway and, very soon, around the world. To understand the cause of this, we need to look at the origin and evolution of both waves. The birth of black metal happened at the beginning of the 80s among a group of people inspired by the gritty heavy metal of Motorhead, the intense hardcore punk of Discharge, and the occult lyrical themes of Black Sabbath. This first wave can be pretty cleanly divided into two camps, the more traditional heavy metal-rooted bands and the proto-extreme metal bands. The first was primarily inspired by Motorhead and Black Sabbath and was spearheaded by Venom and Merciful Fate. The furthest these bands ever went was into what would be called speed metal or thrash metal territory today, but, nevertheless, the term black metal comes from the title of Venom's second album, Black Metal. These bands primarily developed the black metal aesthetic, including the use of anti-Christian or satanic lyrics, pseudonyms, and corpse paint. The second took a much stronger influence from Discharge and was spearheaded by several bands, including Creator, Sodom, Destruction, Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, Bathory, and Sarcophago. Today, all these bands are considered to have made proper black metal for at least some portion of their careers. These bands primarily developed the black metal sound, including the use of lo-fi production, noisy, abrasive riffing, and shrieked vocals, although several incorporated elements of the nascent aesthetic as well, further cementing those features as staples of the genre. So what about the politics of the first wave? The previously mentioned leftward lean of the first wave shouldn't be that surprising given the strong punk and, in particular, D-beat influence on the bands that were part of it. Creator has written songs with explicitly anti-fascist lyrics. Sodom wrote an entire album of songs critical of the Vietnam War, although they've recently come out as enlightened centrist or even right-wing leaning types. Destruction's vocalist, Schmear, has expressed anti-capitalist sympathies. Hellhammer and Celtic Frost's leader, Tom G. Warrior, has expressed several left-leaning views, and Sarcophago supported the Brazilian Communist Party in the 80s. Venom and Merciful Fate have mostly been silent when it comes to politics, but there is no evidence that either are sketchy in any way. Of the major first-wave acts, Bathory is the only band with any hint of fascist ideology, but the extent or even mere presence of that is debatable. The birth of the second wave happened in 1988 in Norway when Dead joined Mayhem. Now, Mayhem formed all the way back in 1984 and had previously been a particularly extreme first-wave band strongly influenced by Bathory, which was next door in Sweden. After Dead joined, the band started to innovate sonically by transitioning away from the power chord riffing typical of 80s metal, which only uses 2 or 3 strings on the guitar, to full chord riffing, which uses every string on the guitar, and would later acquire the name tremolo riffing after the Italian word for trembling. The band also started to take the aesthetics of the genre further, ratcheting up the anti-Christian and satanic image, and intensify the presentation of live shows with Dead often cutting himself while performing, and animal heads impaled on spikes being placed on stage. Soon, many other bands started forming across Norway in a similar vein. Several went much further sonically, incorporating long-form song structures, instruments not common to extreme metal like keyboards and flutes, and folk influences, with a few going so far as to be recognized later as full-on experimental or progressive metal acts. Several others went even further with the aesthetics, for instance claiming to be sincere theistic Satanists and performing actual satanic rites on stage. Overall, the Norwegian second wave scene solidified black metal as its own distinct genre rather than a stylistic offshoot of heavy metal or thrash metal. So then what caused such a radical political shift between the first and second waves? There are four main reasons that this scene in particular fostered Nazi ideology in black metal. First, by 1991, there were more than 10 black metal bands in Norway, and by the end of 1995, by which time this scene had more or less burnt out, there were dozens. But unlike other metal subgenres, and even first-wave black metal, the scene was very insular. For one thing, unlike other extreme genres like death metal, many of the band's lyrical content was purposely designed to turn as many people away from the genre as possible as opposed to simply shock. Some bands went even further, trying to one-up each other in the way they came across and exclude those they thought weren't going far enough. In this atmosphere, the trappings of Nazism became a way for some bands to achieve that goal. Others went the route of more general misanthropy, but Nazi ideology often bled over into such attempts and easily became focused on certain groups of people, usually marginalized groups. Second, undercurrents of nationalism pervaded the scene. This is related to the first reason, but whereas many people that profess to be Nazis are only doing so to appear as extreme as possible, nationalism became something that many bands adopted sincerely. This came about as a combination of some bands becoming interested in pre-Christian Norway due to the general interest in paganism, and the scene taking pride in itself over other countries' metal scenes, particularly Sweden's death metal scene. Nationalism is a stance that metal bands and other genres sometimes take as well, but no collective group made such a point of it before or since. Later on, this also became a common deflection to accusations of Nazism as listeners started to become more socially conscious. Third, as happens all too often in corners of the internet dedicated to irony, such posturing frequently turns into genuine belief. This tends to happen especially if there is already a sympathy towards a watered-down version of the belief, like there was with the Norwegian scene in nationalism, which is one of the ideological foundations for fascism. Not only that, but a few members of the scene have talked about how full-on Nazis became friendly with the scene in an attempt to get its members to adopt the ideology sincerely. Even if we assume that none of the early 90s Norwegian bands were sincere Nazis, which is absolutely not true, future bands and even contemporary bands in other countries took the behavior and ran with it. In fact, it was during the mid-90s, not too soon after the Norwegian scene became widely known among fans of extreme metal, that NSBM began to be developed, and many of the bands that started the genre formed near the beginning of the decade. It is not difficult to trace some of the inspiration for those bands back to elements of the Norwegian scene. Fourth and finally, there is the elephant in the room of Burzum, the solo project of Varg Vikernes. Yes, I know it's difficult to take Varg seriously, and in an ideal world, no one would. But, unfortunately, he has been the patron saint for black metal chuds around the world since the mid-90s, and sadly can't be ignored. One of the most important bands in the Norwegian scene, nearly as central as Mayhem during the scene and arguably more influential afterwards, as well as one of its most important figures, with the spate of church burnings and Euronymous' murder at his hand being the most infamous actions of the entire scene, while Vikernes has repeatedly claimed to not be a Nazi, at the very best, his beliefs fall well under the umbrella of ethnic nationalism, which is just a euphemism for Nazism, and he frequently expresses antagonism towards anything he considers to be degrading European culture, which is just a Nazi dog whistle. And, while Euronymous, being the leader of Mayhem, was the central figure of the scene while he was alive, after his murder, Vikernes soon eclipsed his status. Between his set of beliefs and his continual expression of them, his reputation within the Norwegian scene, and the influence of Burzum's rather unique sound, Vikernes essentially gave form to NSBM from the otherwise somewhat nebulous inclinations of the rest of the scene. Many NSBM and Nazi-aligned bands either started or built entire careers off of Burzum worship. Taking all these points together, the widespread use of Nazi aesthetics and posturing, the genuine interest in nationalism, the tendency for ironic edginess to mutate into sincere belief, particularly when there's already an element of nation acceptance along with a coordinated outreach movement from extremists, and the significant influence of Burzum allowed Nazism and black metal to extend far beyond Norway, the time period of the Norwegian scene, and the original goal of societal opposition. Now, while the second wave was born and centered in Norway, groups around Europe started adopting or forming around the second wave sound rather quickly. And while the Norwegian scene ceded the presence of Nazism in black metal, NSBM as a movement really only developed once other countries black metal was gaining a foothold in had their scenes start pivoting towards more explicit shows of Nazism. The incidence of this varied greatly from country to country, however. For instance, in Greece, while there are bands like Macabre Omen, whose leader, Alexandros, founded the label Demonia Productions, on which, among other things, explicitly Nazi band Der Stürmer released their first demo, there are others like Rotting Christ, far and away the biggest Greek black metal band, who are mostly apolitical, but who spent some of their youth in the Exarchia neighborhood of Athens, the center of Greek anarchism both then and now, from where they gained the inspiration to start the band. And in Sweden, while there are bands like Marduk, who, just a couple of years ago, were caught having purchased items from the Swedish neo-Nazi party, the Nordic Resistance Movement, it also has many bands on the more low-key, melodic side of black metal, like Sacramentum and Ventureland, who are usually completely apolitical. On the other end of the spectrum, there are countries like France, Finland, and several post-Soviet countries, in particular Poland and Ukraine, whose black metal scenes are saturated with NSBM. In France, of the Les Legions Noires, the original French scene, which was even more insular than the Norwegian scene, Vampire Commando had pretty obvious songs like Juden and Comme d'Extermination. Vlad Tepes and two-thirds of Black Murder were composed of the two members of Vampire Commando, and the leader of Mutilation was an early member of Gestapo 666, which, besides its name being rather obvious, had lyrics concerning anti-Semitic themes. Even into more recent times, some of the biggest names in French black metal have very visible ties to NSBM, including Peste Noire, whose lyrics often concern racism and white supremacy, and who happen to be one of the biggest names in NSBM currently. Despel Omega, one of whose members, Mikko Aspa, is one of the most important figures in Finnish NSBM, and even Alcest. Now, Alcest is one of the most hotly debated bands when it comes to sketchiness. The main charge against the band is that its leader, Nij, worked with Peste Noire throughout the 2000s. However, he has since made multiple direct apologies for that, including making explicit statements against any form of discrimination, and seems to have embraced a left-leaning philosophy since then, even openly supporting the BLM movements last year. In Finland, while there is less member continuity between bands, there are frequently more behind-the-scenes connections between ostensibly clean bands and NSBM. Satanic Warmaster is signed to the NSBM label Werewolf Records, Goatmoon's lyrics often concern National Socialism, Baptism was signed to Mikko Aspa's label, Northern Heritage Records, up until the release of its latest full-length, and the band's leader has connections with multiple other sketchy bands, including the explicitly NSBM Trotzreich. Impaled Nazarene have written non-ironic homophobic lyrics as well as some praising ethnic genocide. Clandestine Blaze is Mikko Aspa's band, and the leader of Horna and Sargeist, as well as former member of Behexen, Shatraug, was a member of the band Blutschrei, whose lyrics often concerned white nationalism, as well as ran the label Grieven T Productions, on which several NSBM bands were signed, including Hammer and Kristallnacht, and is overall one of the central figures in Finnish black metal. In both Poland and Ukraine, bands have been particularly expressive of belief in Nazi ideology. In Poland, Graveland's leader, Rob Darkin, has been openly expressing his far-right beliefs in interviews, and is also one of the most important figures in Polish NSBM. Rob Darkin was also one half of Infernum. Infernal War as a band has expressed outright support for Nazism in interviews, and Mgła is signed to Northern Heritage Records. In Ukraine, Druduk dedicated one of its albums to Stepan Bandera, who was one of the main leaders of the massacres of Poles in Volhynia and eastern Galicia during World War II. Hate Forest, among other things, has said that, quote, every subhuman buying Hate Forest releases buys a weapon against himself, unquote. And both Nocturnal Mortem and Crota have performed at the explicitly NSBM Asgard's Rye Festival. Now, even during the second wave, bands were twisting and experimenting with the core Norwegian sound, incorporating folk and symphonic elements, emphasizing atmosphere and melody, and mixing with other extreme metal genres like death metal and thrash metal. And as the second wave began to ebb around the beginning of the late 90s, some bands went even further, incorporating industrial and psychedelic elements and mixing with non-metal genres like hard rock, post-rock, and shoegaze. Soon, entire subgenres within black metal took shape, including atmospheric black metal, depressive suicidal black metal, war metal, and post-black metal. Not only that, but black metal bands began forming outside Europe with ever-increasing frequency. NSBM tended to favor the more abrasive and folk-inflected styles as well as the countries it already had a significant presence in, but it was hardly confined to those ways alone. These trends have more or less continued right up to the present day, although the NSBM front has come under ever-increasing scrutiny over the past several years, as metal listeners have become increasingly conscious of the political affiliations of the bands they listen to, and the counter-subgenre Red and Anarchist Black Metal, or RABM, has grown immensely in popularity and visibility. With such a widespread Nazi problem, being able to determine the sketchiness of individual bands is clearly very important. However, while some bands are pretty obvious, many others try to downplay their Nazi connections. Even though far-right ideas have become far more openly popular in the last 5 years, a simultaneous effort to deplatform such ideas has grown as well. This latter trend has caused NSBM and Nazi-aligned black metal bands to either be more guarded about their beliefs and connections, or accept that they will only ever gain a paltry following even compared to the average clean black metal band. Now, some bands are so glaring about it that it's right there in the band's name. For instance, there are not one, but two bands named Jewicide. Another is the only slightly less overt Volknut, which is the name of an ancient Germanic symbol that has experienced moderate appropriation by white nationalist groups. And if that's not enough, their label, Stellar Winter Records, is an NSBM label. Volknut is a particularly egregious example as, while only active during the late 2000s, they are still discussed without reference to their political affiliation somewhat frequently today. Just below that category of bands are those that have explicit far-right themes in their lyrics or are assigned to an NSBM label. The especially obvious bands can be identified by finding things like racism, white supremacy, and National Socialism among the given lyrical themes on their Metal Archives page, see Peste Noire and Goatmoon, and the especially obvious labels can be identified by finding NSBM explicitly listed among the given styles/specialties on their Metal Archives page, see Werewolf Records. Bands signed to such labels can be assumed to be at least Nazi-aligned. Those bands less frequent about it can be identified by searching for sketchy song titles, see Vampire Commando, or lyrics, see Impaled Nazarene, and those labels less frequent about it can be identified by searching for sketchy bands signed to that label, see Demonian Productions, or by looking into the political connections of whoever owns the label, see Northern Heritage Records. However, the lack of these more outward identifiers does not make a band safe. For one thing, there are many less overt lyrical themes that often mask a band's politics. One class of frequently sketchy lyrical themes includes things like history, folklore, heritage, and nationalism. Now, the latter two are pretty well-known Nazi dog whistles and are hence stronger identifiers, and the former two can be played without far-right political intent. But, for instance, Drudica's Metal Archives page lists one of their two lyrical themes as Ukrainian history/folklore/poetry. A related class includes things like mythology, occultism, Wotanism, and heathenism. As before, the latter two are stronger identifiers, being rooted in Nazi appropriation of Germanic mythology and the occult, but, for instance, Hate Forest's Metal Archives page lists one of their lyrical themes as mythology, and Horna's page lists occultism as one of theirs. Another class includes things like hatred, misanthropy, and nihilism. As mentioned in the first part, such themes tend to get focused on certain groups of people, almost always Jews or other minority groups. One final lyrical theme to note is war. Part historical, part misanthropic, war is a lyrical theme that comes up quite frequently with sketchy black metal bands. Another way to identify sketchy bands is to look into the bands and people they associate with. The main method of association is through bands and members are either concurrent or former members of. Nazi musicians will often hide their more overt music as a side project to keep their main project's popularity growing. Other methods of association include collaborations, collective tours, and just any sort of project that involves people from outside the band. For instance, Graf, the lead vocalist for Psychonaut 4, has done guest vocal work for at least 4 bands related in some way to NSBM, one of which is directly NSBM, having National Socialism as a lyrical theme. Moonsorrow has toured with at least one NSBM band, and the tour in question happened just last year, and which Moonsorrow has publicly defended, and Dan Kapp, the lead guitarist for Winterfell for 5 years, did design work for Burzum throughout that time, including on the full-length The Ways of Yore, on which he took an existing painting and added a border of swastikas to it. And Winterfell, while not an out-and-out NSBM band, have seemed pretty comfortable with the subgenre and frequently expressed nationalistic sentiments in their lyrics. Finally, there is looking into the political actions of or interviews with either one of the band's members or the band as a whole. The former tend to be more revealing politically. These can oftentimes be the most direct way of identifying a band's sketchiness outside of overt lyrical themes. For instance, both Clandestine Blaze and Gravelands leaders, the previously mentioned Miko Aspa and Rob Darkin, are central figures in the NSBM scenes of their respective countries, and both, particularly the latter, have frequently not been subtle giving their political positions in interviews. And, in the interview with Infernal War, the band, among other things, says this, quote, "Coming to your question, our social and political beliefs are strictly connected with NS, National Socialism, /WP, White Power, but we don't put much of them into our music." It doesn't really get more direct than that. Now, with the ever more widespread understanding of the need to deplatform Nazis, many black metal bands have begun making statements distancing themselves from Nazi ideology when under scrutiny. Such statements typically go one of two ways, either passing the evidence off as an expression of edginess or some less extreme ideology, such as standard nationalism, or outright ignoring the evidence and just claiming to not be Nazis. Now, the intent of appearing edgy has been present in metal from its very beginnings, and Nazi posturing for the purposes of appearing edgy goes far beyond metal, but even in the past, that method of doing so was at best tasteless, and today everyone should know better. That sort of explanation could work if it is made by an older band whose sketchy behavior is decently mild and confined to early in their career, but even in that case, explicitly anti-Nazi statements and, even better, anti-Nazi behavior are preferable, and otherwise means very little. And passing Nazi behavior off as an expression of a less extreme ideology is ultimately context-dependent, being conditional on the severity of the behavior and what they seem to be saying between the lines. For instance, nationalism, while not nearly as extreme as Nazism, is still an inherently reactionary ideology, and one that is often given to mask a person's deeper belief in Nazism. Finally, it should go without saying that, especially in today's political climate, one's words mean very little if they do not match their behavior. Taking a step back, there are a few important caveats to this analysis that need to be made. One, not every tale is on the same level. A band having history as a lyrical theme is not even remotely comparable to a band's name being Jewicide. In fact, there are leftist bands that have history as a lyrical theme. Panopticon, arguably the most well-known NSBM band, has it listed first on its Metal Archives page. For weaker tales, it's context or the presence of other stronger tales that settles a band's sketchiness. Panopticon writes songs commemorating two anarchists executed for murders they were falsely accused of, while Judic dedicates albums to war criminals. 2. Even for more moderate tales, there are sometimes extenuating circumstances that muddy a band's sketchiness. For instance, John Halm, the lead vocalist and one of the guitarists for Agalloch, made an anti-Semitic comment on Facebook in 2019, but both the rest of Agalloch, which had broken up 3 years prior, and the rest of the band he formed after that, Pelorian, condemned it, Pelorian going so far as to break up itself over it. Not to mention, the rest of Agalloch went on to form the band Corrada, whose lyrics often concerned anti-capitalism. And third, sketchiness is not binary, but rather a sliding scale. Bands like Magua, while still rather bad in that they contribute to the persistence and continued popularity of NSBM, are not nearly as bad as outright NSBM bands like Peste Noire or Goat Moon. Taking another step back, it's also important to remind yourself why this analysis is even necessary in the first place. The primary reason is that NSBM and Nazi-affiliated bands help platform Nazism itself. More specifically, they support it monetarily, they contribute to its normalization in society, and they are an avenue for radicalization to it. Now, monetary support is definitely the most harmful component of the three, and in the black metal scene is by far the most relevant. Probably the most egregious example is the previously mentioned Asgard's Riot Festival, which was founded by a neo-Nazi to bring together NSBM and crypto-NSBM bands with neo-Nazi fans. The worst part about it, however, is that its founder, as well as others connected to its creation and evolution, have links to the Azov Battalion, a military unit active throughout the war in Donbass on the Ukrainian side that has well-documented links to neo-Nazism and has even committed acts of torture and war crimes during the war. The group is so bad that the US Congress actually blocked further military aid to the unit due to their white supremacist beliefs in 2018. Now, just think about that for a second. In 2018, Trump was president, and both houses of Congress were controlled by Republicans. The Azov Battalion is so bad that even that government couldn't justify supporting them. There is every reason to believe that funds raised during the festival go straight into the pockets of this group, and any money that goes to bands that appear at the festival, whether earned at it or otherwise, still supports the continued existence of it. There are also individual bands like the previously mentioned Marduk that use the money they make to support far-right groups directly, money they only have from people that support their music. Finally, while normalization and radicalization are rather small effects of the Nazi presence in black metal due to the genre's simple lack of popularity, each and every avenue matters, and it's pretty reasonable to think that it acts as one for the radicalization of young people who are into extreme metal. Just look at how NSBM as a movement grew partially out of Burzum admiration. This all begs the question, how should you approach black metal consciously? On the one hand, it should be pretty obvious that you should never give money to bands with explicit ties to Nazism, while, on the other, it's also pretty obvious that you shouldn't feel the need to avoid bands whose only tell is that their lyrics sometimes have historical themes divorced from any sort of far-right political context. But there's a lot of gray area in between that can oftentimes feel difficult to be similarly definitive about. This question feeds into the debate over whether you can separate art from the artist, and, more broadly, into the concept of death of the author. Now, I will not weigh in on those more philosophical questions here. Many other people with a much stronger background in media criticism have already done so, and I don't even have a firm position on the issue myself. However, I have come up with a set of minimal rules for engaging with black metal that you can easily apply to other genres of music or even completely different forms of media. You can easily set stricter rules, but doing any less could compromise conscious approaches to being a black metal fan. 1. Do not engage at all with actively Nazi bands. To be clear, by actively Nazi, I mean bands that either make no secret of their Nazi beliefs or directly support Nazi groups, and by engage, I mean financially support, discuss, or even listen to. Again, the reason to not give such bands money is rather clear, but discussing such bands can inadvertently encourage other people to do so, and, speaking from personal experience, listening to such bands ends up weighing on your consciousness, internalizing that the band's members unwaveringly hold such horrible beliefs. 2. Do not financially support Nazi-adjacent bands. By Nazi-adjacent, I mean bands that don't satisfy either of the two conditions for the first rule, but that either have ties to band or individuals that do, or, for whatever reason, have an unshakable level of sketchiness. While it is not certain that any money you give such bands will go to support Nazi ideology, it is also not certain that it will not, and it's best to practice caution in such instances. And, at least with bands that satisfy the first condition, it is more than likely outright that it will. And 3, do engage with and especially financially support, if possible, leftist and anti-Nazi bands. While part of the reason NSBM and general Nazi affiliation grew to become such a problem in black metal was the lack of opposition from the broader public, another was the lack of opposition from the musicians themselves. Black metal came to be seen as a right-wing genre, and fewer leftists tried to enter it over time. The counter-subgenre RABM has grown considerably in recent years, but it's still dwarfed by Nazism's presence in the greater genre. The best way to ensure RABM's continued growth is to financially support leftist bands, as it supports their existence and encourages new bands to form. But listening to and discussing such bands also helps, as it reduces Nazism's hold over the genre and the discourse surrounding it. To help guide you in getting into RABM, here's a flowchart, and here's a more comprehensive list of bands. The RABM subreddit in general is very helpful, with a set of sketch threads where users can learn and inquire about the sketchiness of particular bands, general discussion threads for broader questions, and information about new releases. Black metal is not an inherently Nazi art form. The first wave was mostly anti-Nazi, and the Norwegian scene, sketchy as it often was, did not establish it as a fixture of the genre. Not only that, but Nazis should not be allowed to take over established art forms, or even have dedicated insular art forms for that matter. Black metal should not be abandoned as a musical style just because Nazis have infested it. To that end, bands, particularly those who are sketchy in one way or another, need to be encouraged to make statements condemning Nazism, as well as to follow through on them in their future behavior. Those that fail, for whatever reason, need to be isolated from the metal community, and those that are actively anti-Nazi need to be supported as much as possible. While an undeniably off-putting genre, black metal should not have it focused on marginalized groups for any reason.